Hi, this is Mrs. Tyler, and today we are going to be looking at Unit 3, Note 6, Part 2, Fighting the War. All right, so these are the two pages we've been working on. We have these three battles left on page 14 in our notes packet, and we have to talk about the Gettysburg Address, William Sherman, and the last date in our, the last two dates in our Civil War timeline. All right, so let's get going. We were talking, this we covered in part 1. Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee decided, once again for the second time in the war, to risk invading the North. The first time he did this was at the Battle of Antietam, which was in Maryland, one of the border states. This time, and it didn't go very well that time either. That was the bloodiest single day in American history, was that 23,000 casualties. So the South surrendered, or not surrendered, but retreated. This time, though, General Lee is hoping to capture a northern city to convince the Union to just give up. On July 1st, Union and Confederate troops met west of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Union had about 90,000 troops under the command of the newly appointed General George Meade. Robert E. Lee had brought troops, about 75,000 Confederate troops. The Battle of Gettysburg was a 3-day battle, had about 50,000 casualties. The Union lines held strong while Confederate armies tried to find weak spots in their position, but the Union Army had the advantage of holding higher ground at Cemetery Ridge and had more soldiers. Gettysburg is an important victory for the Union. It's what we call the turning point of the Civil War, because the South will never again try to take a northern city or invade on northern soil again. So on page 14 in our notes, you're going to write down turning point, the South never invaded the North again. November 19th, 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to speak to a crowd gathered to honor the thousands of men who had been buried in a new cemetery there, the First National Cemetery. The first and primary speaker of the event was a man named Edward Everett. He had a dedication speech that went on for nearly 2 hours. Oh, it seems really long. People were a little surprised then when President Lincoln got up and gave his dedication speech in less than 3 minutes. Ironically, in his speech, President Lincoln says, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here," but his speech became one of the most famous of all time. Sometimes quality is better than quantity, as Edward Everett may have learned. He went on for 2 hours. I bet hardly anybody remembered what he talked about for 2 hours, but President Lincoln's short 3-minute speech is one that we analyze in history classes across the country for decades now. The Gettysburg Address was meant to dedicate the cemetery for the fallen soldiers of the Battle of Gettysburg, but Lincoln also encouraged Americans to be dedicated to protecting the ideals of freedom on which the nation was founded. So Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address in 1863. Put that on the timeline of the Civil War on page 13. Then we watched President Lincoln give the address, and we did a little bit of analyzing. We put a star next to the part of the phrase in the Gettysburg Address that is borrowed from the Declaration of Independence. So that phrase that Lincoln is saying, this country was founded 87 years ago on this whole idea that all men are created equal. And now we're fighting a war to actually test if that nation that's dedicated to equality can actually last long. Okay, he says that we came to dedicate this portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation might live. He gives credit to the brave men living and dead who died there, who struggled there, for actually already doing the hard work of consecrating it and hallowing and dedicating that land. So what he encourages Americans to do is to remain dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion for the cause, that cause of equality that he talked about way up here, this cause, for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. Okay, so that's the Gettysburg Address. On the timeline on page 2 of our front of our packet, for the whole Unit 3 packet, and the inside cover on page 2, we have our main timeline, and I want you to add Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address in 1863. Have a couple of memes here. That's so 7 years ago. A score, when you're talking about time, is 2 20 years. So President Lincoln is saying 407 years ago. 4 would be 4 times 20, which is 80, and then 7 years is 87. In our notes, would you please highlight these 3 context clues? Gettysburg Address is a famous speech, given by Lincoln in 1863 at the site of the Battle of Gettysburg to honor the fallen soldiers and to inspire Americans to remain dedicated to the cause of freedom. In May of 1864, under the orders of Union General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Army wages total war through the South. Grant chose William T. Sherman to lead a destructive campaign starting in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, and marching all the way across Georgia down to the coastal city of Savannah. After burning the city of Atlanta, Sherman promised to make Georgia howl by purposefully destroying everything of value as he led Union troops on a march to the sea. They trampled and burned fields, they stripped houses of valuables, they killed any animals that they could not use for feeding the Union Army, and they destroyed everything useful within a 60-mile wide path. In December of 1864, Sherman captured Savannah, Georgia. From there, he and Union troops started marching north, where they had a plan to meet up with General Grant and a huge majority of the Union forces, and their plan is to now just batter Richmond, Virginia, where the Confederacy has its capital city. They're going to get closer and closer to the capital city. Lincoln was like, want to capture Atlanta? And I was like, sure, man. So William T. Sherman on page 13. Union general chosen by Grant to lead the destructive campaign through Georgia from Atlanta to the coast of Savannah. And on page 14, the Savannah campaign, General Sherman waged total war through Georgia. When we talk about total war, one of the things that makes it different from other battles is that we are not just fighting a battle against an enemy. We are targeting non-military things as well. Buildings, farms, they light crops on fire, they tear down buildings, they pull up a railroad track and get it all hot, and they tie it up into knots around trees, and they slaughter animals that they can't use to feed the army. All that stuff is done in order to cripple the state of Georgia and also make people worry about the safety and security of their farms, their families. It's to really weaken the resolve of the South and make it not worth it anymore to keep fighting. Are you William Tecumseh Sherman? Because you're burning everything, says Gordon Ramsay. Richmond, Virginia. This is the capital city of the South. For 9 months, Grant's forces battered Lee's army at the little town outside of Richmond, Virginia called Petersburg. This is kind of the last line of defense before you could get into Richmond. On April 1st, 1865, Union forces finally broke through those Confederate lines and they were able to capture Petersburg. Within 2 days, the Union Army marched right in to Richmond, Virginia, and they demolished the city. So you can kind of see the rubble in the background. I'll show you that up close in just a second. General Lee realized that his troops are surrounded by Grant's forces, and he tells his officers there's nothing more to do but to go and find Grant and surrender. Here's Richmond, Virginia before, and Richmond, Virginia after. General Lee sent soldiers to find a location where he could hold the formal surrender. So he sent them to find a place where they could have this meeting. Ironically, the first man that they came across was Wilmer McLean, and we talked about him in part 1 when we talked about the first Battle of Bull Run. His front yard was the site where the first and second battles of Bull Run were fought. And after so much death and fighting on his property, he decided to sell that house and move his little grocery business to somewhere quiet where the war wasn't going to impact him. So it's completely ironic that he is the first person they come upon, and this is where they ask, do you know of a place where we can hold the formal surrender? General Lee needs to surrender to General Grant, and he offers up his front parlor. So the war that technically started in his front yard at the first Battle of Bull Run ends in his parlor in a completely different house in a different city. On April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, officially ending the U.S. Civil War. General Grant's terms of surrender were very generous. He allowed the Southern soldiers to return home to their homes peacefully. He didn't even strip them of their weapons or their horses or any of that. He just said, "Go home. Everyone's exhausted from this war. Just go home to your families and what's left of your homes and farms." So, the war ended when General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, which is the name of the city, not the house, but it's called Appomattox Courthouse, and it's happened on April 9th, 1865. Civil War jokes? I generally don't find them funny. On the timeline of the Civil War, you're going to write in South surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Losers generally whine. I'll grant you that. South surrendered at Appomattox, April of 1865.